Hello, is this loud enough? Can you hear me? All right. So the title of my talk is Migrating Critical Apps to React, but most of these lessons are really going to be framework agnostic and can be applied to any framework. So how many people here use React? Okay, like 10. How many want to use React? Is that the same people? How many people use Angular? Okay, Backbone? Nobody. One, okay. Okay. Some other sort of framework? Sprout Core, okay. Ember, okay. All right, so my name is jamischarles. I'm a UI engineer on the Send Money team at PayPal. And I've been there for about 14 months now. And I'll be talking about the lessons that we learned while gradually moving an application to React or kind of starting that migration. So let's go way back to 2014. In 2014, the Send Money app looked kind of like this. Looks like it hasn't changed since 1998, right? So on the back end, it was a bunch of C++ code, and on the front end, it was some custom XML markup. Really not a great dev experience. And so my team was charged with building and rolling out the new Send Money experience, which looked like this. I know! So this was built on a modern stack using Node and Kraken on the server side. And then on the client side, we're using Require.js, Backbone, and Dust.js as our templating language. That's Jamin. He works on my team. He just booed. Okay, so when I joined, this had been ramped to about 5% in the US. And in the coming months, we ramped this up to about 100% in the US. And things worked out really well for a while. We were pretty happy with our choice to use Dust because it allowed us to use the same templates both on the client and on the server. And this came in really handy when we went from a server-rendered app to a single-page application. So it worked well for a while until our team had a little hackathon. And the goal of our hackathon was to make our flow feel faster. And so we came up with something kind of like this. There's a lot of transitions, a lot of animations. It was a smoother experience, and our metrics went up, so everybody was happy with it. So, okay, so now we're not just going to push this in, of course, because we're in a lot of places. And so we're going to slowly ramp this up. And now we have the challenge of having to support two flows at the same time. But these aren't two entirely different flows. Most of the model code, most of the backend code is the exact same. So we have different UI, but a lot of shared code. And this got really ugly for us really fast. So this led to a few issues. So some of the pain that we were feeling at this point was we had way too many abstraction layers. We had low confidence. This means that when we made a fix over here, we had low confidence that it wouldn't break something over here in the code, or it wouldn't cause weird, squirrely behavior. There are difficult state bugs. So you'd be on the first page, you'd go to the second page, you would change the selected currency, you would go back, and it wasn't what it was supposed to be. Lots of weird issues like this. Let's take a look at one of these examples, the first one. So this is the first page of our old flow. Say that I have this currency code list here, and I want to change the second item from Australian donuts because we want them to finally use a real currency in Australia, which is, let's say, Australian yen. And in order for me to track down where this state came from, I have to go through a path. Usually I'll start at the template, right? So this is the path I have to go through. And this feels like swimming upstream. I have to make all these hops, and each of these is a gap that I can fall into and get lost. So this is 7 layers. This is crazy. Has anybody ever had a problem like this in their code base? It's extremely painful. Okay. So it was very easy to get lost. This is a pretty bad dev experience, right? Nobody was happy. Everything is not awesome. But we have to balance our unhappiness and our pain with the fact that we have over 100 million users in over 100 different countries. We can't just up and change to the newest flavor of any framework whenever we want to. We have to be responsible, and we have to have the appropriate amount of rigor. So what do? We started exploring. We started looking at Ember and React. One of the things that we really liked about Ember was the structure that it added. It was super opinionated, and it added a lot of structure that our app was severely lacking. React looked really interesting, but we just didn't know enough at this point. So we did a few Ember experiments. One of my coworkers, he built a small feature in Ember. We pushed it out to prod, and we were fairly happy with it. So then we started seeing a lot of tweets from somebody in the community about Ember. And I'm going to list some of them here, but I've blurred out his name to protect his identity. So we started seeing tweets like this. Who does not know who this is? No? Everybody knows? Okay, great. It's like that. It's like that. It still goes on and on and on and on and on. This next one is probably my favorite. Now, I don't know if this is an endorsement or a criticism of Ember, but I don't know. Okay. Now it seems like they finally made up. There's peace in the land. Everybody's happy. Okay, so we looked at Ember. Now we wanted to take a look at React. ReactConf was just around the corner. This was around December of last year. And at this point, we'd done our homework. We'd done our research. We'd hacked together a few proof of concepts with React. But we were still on the fence. Are we going to send people to EmberConf or to ReactConf? And the reality at this point is that ReactConf just happened sooner. And so we went to ReactConf. Okay. So 5 of us went, and we were really excited. The things we were excited about was that Facebook seemed to be having the same problems that we were having. And they were claiming that React was solving these problems for them. We were really excited about the principles they were talking about, though. Because when you choose a framework, you're not just choosing a framework, you're choosing the ecosystem and the principles and the philosophies behind that. So we love the focus on functional styles and principles. And we realized that a lot of these principles would solve most of our problems. So we really bought into the ideas behind React. Simplify state, immutable data, functional principles. We could start doing a lot of these things right now. So we thought, okay, let's try React. So PayPal is a big company. A lot of times at big orgs, it can be really hard to get things moving, right? So we sat down, we looked, okay, what is our single biggest issue for at least trying React out? The biggest blocker we found was I18N. How many people here use I18N? Wow, like 10% maybe, okay. So let me walk through what I18N looks like on our team. So we have a property file at the very top, and we have the English version. So if you're an English speaker in the US, you see the content at the top. Right below that is the content you see if you're a German speaker in Germany. And there's the key value pairs for the notes widget. So that piece up here is combined with the dust template, which then magically turns into a JavaScript file which is localized with this content, which we load in using require.js, and then we use dust to render that into our DOM. So the issue we had at this point is that React can't read a property file. And we couldn't really change that at this point because a lot of our infrastructure was using property files. We had content people using it. So the first thing we needed was to convert our property files into JSON. Okay, which looked kind of like this, fairly simple. We had a grunt task that moved it over. The second thing we did is we built an I18N mixin. Who does not know what a mixin is? Okay, so a mixin is basically, it decorates something with additional functionality. That's the simplest way of probably explaining it. Okay, so we built an I18N mixin. Let's take a look at that for a second. So the important pieces here, we're pulling it in. We are specifying where the locale file is that we want to read from. And then we say which key we want. And then there's magic that says, okay, you're in this country, you speak this language, I'm going to pull that string. Fairly simple. Okay, so now at this point, ITN works, but we still have one big issue. We're still on require.js. Who here uses require.js? One. Okay, wow. Webpack? Okay, something besides that? Who uses vanilla just script tags? Everybody's too embarrassed to say. Okay. All right. So there's two big issues with require.js. One, it made client-side dependencies for testing really hard with Mocha. And two, the whole React ecosystem was built around NPM and being able to pull down things. So if I want to try out this Flux framework or this one or that one, that's really hard to do with require.js because you basically have to manually pull these things down. But these things are really easy to do with Webpack. So Jamin Ferguson, the guy sitting right there, he moved this over to Webpack. He spent about 2 days working on it, issued a PR. Then it sat open for a few weeks while we looked at it. We did some back and forth. We reviewed it and made sure it worked. We all loved it. But why were we happy about this? The single biggest thing that it gave us is we could use client-side require and NPM modules. This is huge because now all of a sudden anything on NPM you can easily pull down to your client-side code. This is awesome. This is a huge win. You can now use common.js in your client-side code. You can just require in files. You can use Babel Loader, which you've heard about a bunch today, to load in JSX files. You can use JSX in your files and use ES6 features. So the huge win here was that we could start using these modern features and still keep our old code living side by side. And that's a great migration path. And so people are happy because the cost and the pain of trying out new things is really low, and that usually makes devs happy. Okay, so you might think, do I have to do all these infra changes before I could even think about moving to React? Well, I'm a little bit biased, but you should really be doing all these things anyway. At this point, this is best practices. Having a module loader, having something awesome like Webpack, these are best practices. This will improve your existing workflow. Okay, so let's see an example. We can use ES6 imports right now. So this is what our AMD code looked like. The important pieces are here. You specify, I want to pull in this currency code view file. I'm going to assign that to the currency code viewed variable, which will magically be available within this inner function. Let's look at what the ES6 imports version looked like. Okay. This is really, really simple. I'm a huge fan of this. So you specify the file name. What's being exported from there will be assigned into this variable, which is globally available in this file. And this is great. So here you're specifying what is going to be exported from this file. This is extremely clear. Import and export. It's great. This is what the full example looks like. Okay, so let's now talk about some of the lessons that we learned during our first pull request. So the infrastructure was in place now. Everybody's super excited. What should our strategy be moving forward? So we have a big app. I mean, it's like 3 or 4 pages, but there's a lot of edge cases. We can't just rewrite everything in 1 week, and that's a total non-starter. So that's not going to work. So we have to look and say, what's going to be the first feature that we can move over, push to prod, make sure all the infrastructure works. So we look on here and say, okay, everything here is really important. There's probably not a good candidate here. What about on this page? What's the least important thing in this flow? And in this case, it's this notes field. And this is a great candidate for several reasons. One is, if I'm going to screw something up in this flow, I want it to be this notes field. I don't want to screw up who I'm sending money to, and I don't want to screw up how much money I'm sending. I want to screw up the note that goes along with the transaction. Because if you try and send your friend $100 and you instead send him $1,000, that's going to be a really bad situation. Somebody's going to get fired, probably. Maybe. I don't know. Okay. So this is a good candidate because it has some JavaScript resize based on the content in here. There's a counter over here. And there's this nice placeholder, so there's some ITN stuff. It's complicated enough that it's a good example. Okay, so My wife went out of town for a weekend, and I said, I'm just going to move this one piece over and issue the PR, and let's see what happens. So in that first PR, I took the Dust template, moved it over to React and JSX. I decoupled the resize logic from Backbone. I wrote tests for the resize code. I added __ test folder next to the code because this is something the React core project does, and I was like, this is kind of an interesting pattern. I'd like to try it out. Then I had to change all the testing helpers to work with __ tests. And this got merged instantly, right? Yeah. Wah wah. Okay, so this sat open for 2 months. So what should I have done instead? All we really needed was these two things. We needed to change over the template logic and the event binding logic. For my team, for my peers, I had created way too many decision points by doing all this extra stuff down here, which really didn't matter for our first exercise and trying to fit it into our code base and seeing if we liked it or not. So the big lesson here is, because none of these things really mattered yet. So the big lesson here is keep your first PR dead simple when you're trying out something new like this. Okay. My next point is how to optimize for future change. So at this point, it's been 2 years since we chose our original stack. That is an incredibly short amount of time to choose a whole new stack. But if this holds true, especially with the amount of change and new frameworks we're seeing here, chances are in 2 years we're going to be choosing another new framework, right? Elm? Woo! Elm. Okay, so we have to ask ourselves, how can we reduce the cost of switching? And so around this time I was thinking about this and I found this great quote. You have to build a barrier between yourself and the framework. Anybody know who Michael Feathers is? No? Okay, awesome. He wrote this great book. It's a little bit dry, it's super long, but it's good. Called Working Effectively with Legacy Code. And so, but what does this quote really mean? If you only take one thing away from my talk, let it be this. You should write as much vanilla JavaScript as possible. Now here's what I mean. Wow. Thanks. Still use things like React, use a routing framework, use frameworks at the appropriate abstraction levels, because those are really good and probably better than your team is going to write. But for modules beyond that, where you write a lot of custom code, keep it vanilla. Don't wrap everything in your framework, because the next time you switch, you're going to have to untangle all that and move everything over to your new fancy framework. So let's look at an example from the notes widget. So what are the important pieces here? Okay. The important pieces here are the event binding and the business rules. So this business logic here handles how the text area is going to grow and shrink as somebody's typing in. So the only things that we really need to change in order to move this over to React is, again, the event binding and the resize logic. So we need to decouple this business logic. What does that look like? We could create a resize text area utils file, which is just vanilla JavaScript, or as vanilla as you can get, and pass it in. And now at this point, you can just pass this in, and if you have to do any event normalization from Backbone to this util or from React to this util, this is a great place to do it. So here, we now have a vanilla utility that can be pulled in from Angular or from Backbone or from React or from whatever future framework you choose to use. So this is great because then in the future, you've reduced the cost of change and you've made it easier to move to your next framework. Because most of the application's custom bits seem to be business logic like this. So if you can separate that, then you're just swapping out, okay, this routing framework for this routing framework, and most of the inputs and outputs should be vaguely similar. Okay, so now we've reduced cost. You've made it easier. How do you convince people? Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. How do people usually react to change? This is what they do, right? You just made me move to this framework 6 months ago, or 1 year ago, or 2 years ago. Please don't make me change again. So what we have to do is reduce the cost of change. If changing isn't so painful, people will be more willing to say, yes, let's try this thing out. Yes, let's move over to this other thing because I'm not going to spend nights and weekends trying to figure out how this thing works. So you'll get a lot less pushback. Things will be less tightly coupled. It'll be easier. So our culture on our team is pretty receptive to new stuff. If there's a new framework out in 2 years, I'm fairly confident we can move to that if it solves the right problems for us. So let's talk about some things that worked for us. We sent 5 people from our team to a conference. This is a great unifying thing and gets a lot of people excited about similar tech stacks. So this worked out really well for us. Hack sessions over lunch. This is a great time to address questions like, ooh, you want to put template logic in my JavaScript file? Are you crazy? I know, a lot of people have this concern about JSX. This is a great time to say, hey, I ported over this widget. Look how much cleaner this code looks. We went from 3 files down to 1 file. It's much easier to reason about. Distribute the work. Jamin did a lot of the infrastructure work. And so when I came in and I said, I want to move this piece over, I didn't have to struggle with those things. I probably would have given up if I had to do that, and then this, but it was much easier for me just to jump in and get started. This is a big one. Don't alienate the last architect. I think it's very common for us to say, oh, the current way is so terrible, it sucks, why did you do it this way, Aaron? It's just the worst. And so instead, go to that person and say, here's what's working, and here's what's not working. Let's improve the piece that's not working and work with these people. That way, hopefully they won't fight against you as hard. Keep momentum. My PR was open for 2 months. Way too long. It's really easy to run out of steam when that happens. Okay, so in conclusion, you have to ask yourself, so please make sure that you solve real problems. You have to ask yourself, what problems are you fixing? Because this is all really new stuff and really cool stuff, and we get really excited about it. So here's a quick story as I'm ramping down. My last job, I was at a company called Family Search. How many people from Family Search are here? All right. It's like 2 rows, okay. So during that time, there were a bunch of articles around, hey, you can stop using jQuery because now there's good enough support with these other things. You don't need to use it anymore. So I thought, okay, great, let's stop using jQuery. So I went around to our team members, I said, what do you think if we dropped jQuery? And one of our engineers was like, please don't. Please don't make me change and learn this new stuff. I'm struggling enough just to keep up with our current stack. So that wasn't solving a problem that our team was having. jQuery was working just fine for them. Okay, so my final thought. So these principles are really to help you solve real problems. If you don't have pain, don't make your team suffer. If you're facing problems, you can start applying these solutions today that we talked about with or without React. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah. Do you want to answer that, Jamie? No. So your question was it hard to move from the asynchronous to the synchronous, essentially? Okay. 2 things I want to say on that. So Webpack can do async. It's not too hard to do. Most of the time, I found with async, it's more of a pain than it's worth. And a lot of times we found we just don't need it and it's not worth it. And that's been my personal experience, though. Anybody else? Yeah. Why do we pick React versus Angular? Ah, that's a good question. Well, should I give the appropriate answer or the real answer? No, we. Okay. The real answer is there's a small part of when you choose a framework that's either gut feeling or hype or reasons that you're not supposed to choose a framework for. And we try to not use any of those biases. We loved all the focus on that Let me go back to my previous point. When you choose a framework, you're really buying into an ecosystem, right? So go and look at what the people behind it are saying, the type of apps that they're building, what problems are they solving, what are they preaching. If you like what they're preaching and you agree with that, it's probably a good idea to choose that framework. With React, we went there, we were huge fans of functional, a huge fan of their focus on patterns over frameworks. When you're doing templating in React and with JSX, you're using a lot of vanilla JavaScript. There's no custom for each thing. There's no custom looping. You're using raw vanilla JavaScript. A lot of it is ES6 features, but it's still vanilla JavaScript. And so that was a huge thing for me because I don't want to spend a year learning all these APIs and frameworks that aren't going to help me in 2 years or in 3 years or in 4 years. I would rather spend my time learning vanilla JavaScript. So for me, their big focus on patterns over frameworks is huge. And so I think probably the single biggest reason was we really liked what they were preaching and what they were selling, and we could really identify with that. And Facebook was having similar problems to the things that we were running into. And did that answer your question, or do you want more? Okay. Great questions. Anybody else? Do you guys want to hear about Flux for a second, or no? Yeah. Okay. I think I have, how much time do I have left? 8 minutes? Okay. Oh, there he is. Okay. I'll talk about Flux for a second. So, who thinks that Flux seems overwhelming? Of those of you who have looked at it. So, learning React enough to use it took me about 3 hours. Learning Flux well enough to use it took me about a week and a half. So that's something that they really need to work on, and I think they're doing a good job with Dan Abramoff released Redux, and I think that is the best way of doing that, in my opinion. I'm a huge fan of that. But I would say don't worry about Flux or anything like that until you've bought into React and what that's preaching, because all these things in this ecosystem are preaching similar things. And so if you buy into what React is selling, then I'm 90% sure you will like what Flux and Redux and all these other things are selling. So for us, we're moving to React, and we're now moving to Redux. And between those two things, we've been really, really happy with what we've seen so far. It's solving real problems for us. And so I'm not unhappy that we didn't choose Angular whatsoever, especially with the Angular 1, 2, all that stuff. And any other questions? Yeah. What are your thoughts on HTTP 2? I have... The only thoughts I have about it is it looks cool. I haven't looked into it a whole lot, besides the fact that it seems like it'll make minification and things like that go away and make it a lot more efficient. I think it seems great. Yeah. TypeScript or Flow? TypeScript. I haven't looked into TypeScript a whole lot at this point. It's a different language. It compiles to JavaScript. Is that right? For me, whenever I have to learn something else that compiles to what I want to write, I have to look very hard at the benefits and the trade-offs. Again, what problem is that going to solve for me? And that's really the single biggest question. At this point, we have huge problems with state, with our data layer and our routing layer, and we have issues there. And right now, these solutions are solving that problem. When what TypeScript is proposing to solve becomes our biggest problem, we will look hard at things like TypeScript and Flow. But until that point, there's no point in even looking at it, in my opinion, for us. Good questions. Anybody else? Who here uses Elm? And no? It's awesome. Okay, yeah.
With regards to maintaining state, what advantage does React have over Ember?
Okay. So the question was, what advantage does React have over Ember in regards to maintaining state? I've spent like 5 hours with Ember, and I've spent probably 100 hours with React now, so I can speak much better to the React side. But the big things that React gives you is it's very functional. What I mean by functional, who here is familiar with the term pure function? Okay, just a few people. So the idea in functional programming with a pure function is you avoid side effects. Whenever you pass in the same parameters, you get the same result out every single time. That means there's no global variables. You're just passing things in and getting things out. And it's safer because you know it's not messing with state over here. And so the big thing with React is its big focus on functional style. So the idea with React is it doesn't care where the state came from. You just pass in state and it renders it out. And which pairs really nicely with Flux, which handles your state management in a very unidirectional way. If you want to watch a video on Flux, there's great videos on the Flux homepage. They're great. I don't know if that, did that answer your question enough? Or if you have more, come talk to me after. We can chat more about it. Anybody else? Am I out of time? Or 3 minutes. Anybody else? Yeah, and then you and then. Yeah, what's up?
How far is your app? All React?
I knew somebody would ask that. Right now, we're probably about 10 or 15% of the way there. My prediction is it'll either be a month or a year, because that's how it tends to work.
What do your bosses do with a month or a year?
What do my bosses do with it?
How do they deal with that in a month or a year?
Well, the thing with this is we, the engineers, are driving this, right? Our bosses have said, yes, we're having these problems, and what are you going to do about it? And we said, okay, we think React will really solve this problem for us. And they said, great, you make it happen. And so this weekend, I've been working a lot on replacing the router with React Router and things like that. So really comes down to you have to have one person or 2 or 3 people who are really excited enough to either push back on product enough to say, I'm going to work on this week, and you're not going to say no, or your boss kind of carving out a little bit of time for you. I mean, the reality is features usually win, right? And so hopefully you have a good enough boss that he'll allow you to push back a little bit so you don't have to do it all in your free time. Great questions. Anybody else? Yeah.
Seems like React still has, I mean, it's kind of, I mean, it hasn't hit version 1. Are there big changes between, 2013 and 2014 that you feel like are going to make the road to 1.0 difficult?
That's a great question. One of the philosophies of the React core team is that they don't force anybody at Facebook to use React, but it's gained huge adoption there. So they have a huge focus on, let's make this easy for people to use, and people will use it if it's the best option out there. And so one of the things they did, which Jamin showed, is they have this utility which upgrades the hard parts from 13 to 14 in your code base automatically, things like that. So we haven't found anything major from 13 to 14 that's caused issues for us, but they have a huge focus on making it as painless as possible while still moving forward, and I think that's awesome. That really resonates with me because right now they have a huge focus on the dev experience, and because they have a huge belief that if the dev experience is really good, you're going to build really good apps, and you're going to ramp up quickly and build great things. Anybody else? You had a question?
I'm just going to ask the question that I know is on everybody's mind.
Okay.
You work at PayPal. Do you or do you not have a giant bank account that you use to test your app and send yourself money?
I have a I have a command line utility which generates accounts for me, but they aren't real accounts.
You can literally script yourself to wealth, is what you're saying.
Fake wealth, yes.
Okay. Oh, okay. Anyway, that's all our time. Thank you. Give a round of applause to Jamischarles. Thank you, Jamis.